Lovely to see you all here. To tick through, it's the third of our fourth digital AdOps webinars today. Thank you so much for all the commitment and attendance. It's been great seeing you all. These webinars are being sort of a substitute replacement for our physical events that we'd normally be running at this time. We alternate every 6 months between Melbourne and Sydney. We're still hopeful that we can go ahead at the end of September in Sydney with some form of physical event, which will run some live streaming and some webinars alongside, but we'll see. We're joined today by a superstar group. We're going to have a panel with everyone towards the end. But prior to that, we'll have the guys at IAB Tech Lab run us through some standards. And the overview there is to look at the best practices in relation to programmatic transparency, but also ad fraud and brand safety. And that might feel like a lot of topics to cover in one area, in one event. But actually, that's a sort of area of consideration, one of the 4 pillars, as it were, that Tech Lab focus on. So for them, it's very logical just to cover all those off. And you'll see that in the presentation that we'll have in a moment from Jill and Amit, who are coming in live and direct from San Francisco. And then we'll have Adele, Malcolm, Jess, and Emil join us for the panel. Please submit your questions through the Q&A tool. We will weave them into the panel. We've got plenty of time for the panel, so please send them through. But for now, we will kick off with an introduction to and an overview of the IAB Tech Lab standards. Over to you, Jill and Amit. Thank you very much.
All right. Can you all hear me now?
I can see you. I can hear you.
All right. I'm going to switch to my slides, JJ.
Yep. Kick me off.
All right. How about that?
Perfect.
All right. Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me on this session. I'll kick off with talking about a little bit about the Tech Lab. I'll also cover some of the brand safety specifications that we've been working on. And then Jill is going to cover the ad fraud related specifications. And like Jay said, there's definitely a lot to cover on this topic. We'll probably be scratching the surface to a certain degree, but hopefully this will get some ideas rolling and kick off some good conversations. First about the Tech Lab, you may already have seen, for those who, even for those who don't know about the Tech Lab, you've probably seen many of these names before. I like to say that we are probably responsible for all the abbreviation acronyms in the ad tech industry. But hey, we're also, I think, really helping everybody in the ad tech industry talk to each other. And that's basically a big part of our mission, right? So basically to help develop some of the core foundational technologies and standards that'll help the overall ecosystem, the ad tech and media ecosystem. And really do that as a nonprofit organization that's global in nature. And we work with all the various IABs in different regions. And this kind of talks about what we do, which is really focus on the standards and protocols and some of the tools like open measurement that you may have heard of in the last session that Jill was on. We also have compliance programs focused on helping the adoption and implementation, if you will, of these standards, and of course help with the educational events such as these. And we obviously work with the local IABs in all the different regions to really help. They are focused on the actual issues and topics that are of interest in each region, and they work on the guidelines that are most relevant. We kind of help bridge the gap between those kind of things as well as the technology standards. And finally, a quick rundown of the various priorities that we have seen that we have at the Tech Lab, and really is driven by our members across the globe. The privacy and consumer IDs are probably something that all of you have heard of with REARC and other topics. Measurement and attribution is definitely a big one, and was also, like I said, covered on the previous session. And today we're going to focus on transparency, which is a very big part of brand safety and anti-fraud efforts. So what is brand safety, and how is ad fraud related to that? So brand safety is the set of tools that are used by the brands to ensure that they do not have to protect them against negative consumer sentiment, right? So basically, things that are that may result in them being surfaced in the wrong context or wrong content, and also things that are not providing them a good, reasonable, good return on investment. And ad fraud is definitely a whole bunch of things that are included in ad fraud, which may not be directly tied to brand safety, but there are a number of things which do impact how people look at brands, right? So if you have a bad experience and tied to malware and things like that, there are definitely a lot of things which would negatively impact a brand's. It would impact the brand. So these are the set of standards that we consider as foundational pieces that we help around brand safety. I'll be covering taxonomies in depth, and we'll quickly cover the rest of those things, on this slide. But again, feel free to reach out to me if you want to get into more detail with any of these topics. The content taxonomy is something that, actually, before I go into that, so there are two taxonomies that we focus on over here around brand safety. One is the content taxonomy, and the second is the ad product taxonomy. The content taxonomy describes what a site or an app is all about, while the ad product taxonomy describes the ad itself, what the ad is about, what the product or the service described in the ad is about. And with the 2.0 version of the content taxonomy, we kind of provided a lot more metadata about the ad, about the content, right? So basically, you can talk about how you can actually tag a piece of content with multiple categories, things like automotive, or in this particular example. In addition to that, you can also add context around what kind of channel that content came from. Is it editorial? Is it user-generated? Things like that. Then you also can add some additional context around the type of content, whether it's news or any other detail that you can provide. All of this is quite important to enable the brand safety vendors to really describe a piece of content in as much detail as possible, which allows for buyers to take some really interesting and intelligent decisions about the content that they want to surface their ads on. With 2.1, which was released, I think, last week, we added an additional layer of context within the taxonomy. We introduced the concept of special category data, which really was driven by concerns around the privacy issues, especially in some of these categories that could be considered sensitive, right? Things like race, ethnic origin, politics, and so on. And the idea really is to ask the publishers and the brand safety vendors to deal with those particular pieces of content with a little more sensitivity. Make sure that those pieces are not really tied to a particular user, and have to have a little more intelligence on how you target, especially based on those categories. And what we are working on now with 2.2, is something that's probably very relevant in today's world. Especially, I'm sure that everyone has heard about the challenges around COVID and the blocking that is based off of COVID and things like that. And so the concept of floor categories and suitability has definitely bubbled up quite a bit. We have we've been working with organizations like the GARM, actually the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, who are trying to set a set of a common way to look at some of these categories of content, right? So basically the floor categories that you see out there, things like hate speech, things like explicit content, are things that really should not be monetized at all, should not be there on the platforms at all, but at a minimum should not be monetized by the various platforms. And GARM is one of the organizations that's working with the various platforms, both the social media platforms as well as others, to kind of get a little bit of consistency around how how those platforms are looking at these pieces of content. And the important, we at the Tech Lab are providing the connecting tissue, I guess, by providing that common language that everyone can use when they are talking about these floor categories, right? So when a brand safety vendor is easy, it makes it easy for buyers to go to the brand safety vendors and say, hey, these are the different categories that we want to be very careful about. And now it's kind of clear about what exactly we are talking about there. Along with the floor categories, there's a concept of suitability and risk tolerance. Basically, the idea is that various brands will have varying degrees of tolerance for the kind of content that you're on, right? So you might be, if you're a more hip brand, if you will, you're probably okay with turning up on content which might be a little more controversial, if you will. So that's the idea with the risk tolerance, is to basically provide guidance around, okay, for each of these categories, what are the potential risk tolerance. Now, all that said, it's important to know that this is just the language that we're talking with, right? So you still need the intelligence to really understand what's in the piece of content and how that maps onto any of these categories and any of these tolerance recommendations. So that of course is still important for all the brand safety vendors are really needed to provide that kind of intelligence around these. So those are the that's the detail around the taxonomy and the floor and suitability. In addition to that, we have efforts going on to enable these kind of tools, right? So basically, the only way the brand safety vendors, for example, can really provide that additional intelligence about the content is if they have access to what they need to analyze, and that's provided by the page URLs or other links via OpenRTB and VAST, and we standardize that. Open measurement is another area where we are working on the concept of ad swapping. Basically, that's the ability to swap ads when the content may not be a good match for the original ad. And currently is being done by VPaid, which I know almost everyone hates. And so we are trying to provide a little more thought through and cleaner implementation that allows both the publishers and the verification vendors to be happy, and the buyers, of course. The part which people don't think about as much when they talk about user experience, brand safety, is user experience. Good user experience, both in the content as well as in the ad, is very important for brand safety. So this basically means that advertisers should definitely ask for better built websites and apps. And in addition to that, they really need to be careful about their ads themselves, make sure that they're lightweight, lean, and so on. And finally, anti-fraud standards are, again, like I said, they're not directly brand safety related, but those are important because buyers really would like to make sure that they are buying through safe channels and make sure that they're buying through buying on properties that are considered brand safe. So a couple of quick takeaways that I figured might be worth putting out there. It's important as sellers to use the content taxonomy to tag the content for every ad impression. Make sure that you pass the URL so that brand safety vendors can actually provide their additional thoughts. Use open measurement ad swapping once it's ready. It's still something that we're working on. And of course, focus on good experiences. And as buyers, I think one of the key things that I'm sure has been hammered home in recent times is to not use, not just go by keywords. Don't just use stale and long exclusion lists, and instead use a lot more intelligent context and sentiment analysis tools to make sure that you are not just blanket disabling a whole bunch of content, especially news, if you will. Decide on your risk tolerance, and also decide which kind of content you really want to avoid this, and then work with your partners, your vendors, to make sure that you're able to follow through on that plan. And then, of course, really insist on your platforms and brand safety vendors to use the content taxonomy, make it easier for you to control exactly where your ads appear. And finally, build lean ads. That I think is important. I also have a blog post that I figured I'll plug in over here that where I talk a lot about this topic. So please do feel free to take a look at that. And now, Jill, are you going to? I think she's going to go over the anti-fraud efforts.
Yep. Thanks, Amit. I know Amit covered a lot of content in just a short period of time, and I'm going to take us on a journey through a lot more content. So I'm going to take us through some of the anti-fraud standards. And again, this is a very similar slide to what Amit was just going through that highlights really the suite of standards that the Tech Lab works on to help facilitate anti-fraud efforts. And so you can see those sort of 4 major buckets here, and I'm going to take you through everything on here except for AdStat Cert. And the reason I'm not going to go through that, that is a way to cryptographically sign bid requests that gives much more assurance of sort of the sender of the request and receiver. I mean, it's a lot more thorough, but it has been something that, while available and ready for adoption, is part of sort of a larger effort with OpenRTB 3.0 that we've sort of not seen as much adoption this year, given other priorities within the industry and given resource sort of refocus with sort of the COVID situation. So I'm going to skip over that one for now, but happy to answer questions on it if folks want to reach out to me later. Next slide, please, Amit. So when I'm talking about ad fraud too and anti-fraud measures, what I'm focusing on specifically here, especially with the ads.txt, sellers JSON, and supply chain object suite, is really focusing on counterfeit inventory and transparency. And that's sort of how we'll sort of approach it. The suite wasn't meant to solve for every kind of ad fraud. There are other solutions you can partner with for different types of sophisticated invalid traffic. These are more, it was really based on a problem, I would say in 2017 was when ads.txt first sort of came on the scene, where we were seeing websites that had RTB like availabilities in excess of sort of what was explainable for their traffic and inventory settings. And so this was, malicious intent to fraudulently say that you were a major publisher and offer inventory, and then buyers would buy that thinking that they're buying a major publisher. And then that's not the content that you get if you get content at all. So what we really focused on, again, is transparency within the supply chain, so that sellers could publicly declare who their actual partners are, and then buyers could see that declaration and be able to trace the inventory back to the source, so that they have better assurances in who they're purchasing from. Next slide, please. And so Authorized Digital Sellers was born. That's ads.txt. I think everybody knows, yes, that was launched in June 2017, very broadly adopted at this point. About 2 years later, in 2019, we launched app ads.txt, and that was the same, very similar spec, just for the app environment. And these are really text files that a publisher posts. They host on their website, and it is listing all of the entities that are authorized to sell or resell their inventory. Next slide. And so I'm going to walk us through a pretty basic example. This one is for Washington Post. You can see their ads.txt file here. And just the first seller on the list is Index Exchange. And you can see that that is a direct relationship. And so what this really indicates for us is that Washington Post likely has a direct contract with Index Exchange. All of these specs are really meant to follow the money, is sort of a phrase that the working groups use. They're meant to trace where the direct relationships, being contracts and sort of money changing hands, happens. So this Index Exchange being listed as a direct seller likely means that they have a direct contract with Index Exchange. And you can also see, the publisher ID there, the 183960. And in a bid request then from Index Exchange, a buyer should be able to validate that account number for Washington Post inventory. Next slide, please. And then I'm going to take you through, so that was ads.txt, a very simple format, very few fields. And then I'm going to take you through here sellers.json, which is a slightly newer specification. It is focused on the advertising systems. So someone like Index Exchange would have a sellers.json file. And so what it has more fields. What I've shown here are the 4 required fields because they're the most essential, but there are a handful of additional optional fields for things like confidential or pass-through relationships. So there's some more nuance, I would say, within the sellers.json object. But really the fundamental pieces here are that an advertising system can post sort of the seller ID, seller type, name, and domain. And so these are, I mean, we like to talk about it as the inverse of ads.txt. So if ads.txt is the seller posting their advertising system partners, so their selling partners, sellers.json is sort of posting resellers and direct publisher relationships. So it's helping us to really see transparently the entire potential flow of a potential bid request. Next slide, please. And so this is just a quick example from a sellers.json file. So again, it's very similar. It's a public file. Like you can go to, this is an example of, you go to indexexchange.com/sellers.json and you get their sellers.json file. And so it's a very long file. You can imagine listing all of their partners. So I've done a sort of search to highlight, you know, the specific example that we went through before. So you can see basically within the Index Exchange sellers.json file, you can cross-reference actually what we saw with the Washington Post ads.txt. And so you can see that the seller type here is listed as publisher, indicating that Index Exchange has a, you know, that they have a relationship directly with this publisher, which is sort of the same type of relationship as declared by Washington Post in ads.txt by saying that they have a direct relationship with Index Exchange. And then the other thing I'll call out is that you can see that the seller ID there matches what was posted in the ads.txt file for Washington Post. Next slide, please. And then, so those are public files that are sort of hosted within the either advertising systems website or the publisher website. And then the next piece that I'll go through is called the supply chain object. And this is actually an object that's, you know, we call it a set of nodes. So each sort of set of brackets, a big piece here you're looking at is a node. And what that is trying to highlight, it's within this then comes within the bid request, and it actually is a way for each participant in sort of the supply chain to insert some of that information about themselves, who's passing on the bid request or who started the bid request, et cetera, within the actual bid request. So you can see by the time this gets to a buyer, to a DSP, you should have a entire chain of nodes from sort of the beginning, seeing like who the publisher is, to you know, however many supply chain partners participated before the opportunity for that bid request to be purchased was completed. And so this is, oh, sorry, one more. I've inserted, you can see some information in here. I inserted again, you can see the publisher ID is the one that was referenced between Washington Post and Index Exchange. And then that first node highlighted there is Index Exchange, referencing that they are sort of the first node and the only node in this direct instance selling that inventory. Next slide. And so what I just took you through in both, like all of those examples, obviously a very, very simple buying and selling relationship, in that you have a publisher using an Index Exchange as a single sort of supply partner that could be purchased then by a DSP. But next slide, I'll say that majority and a lot of the inventory relationships within the ecosystem are not that simple. So I use the easiest one just to make it digestible, but you can imagine that this is much more complicated than it appears. Next slide, please. And I think that's where the supply chain object really shines, because what it can do, as illustrated here, is with each hop, as we call them, between publisher and DSP, each partner there is able to insert their relevant information into the bid request through the supply chain object, so that by the time, again, that you get to the DSP making the purchase on behalf of the buyer, you have a complete history of sort of who's participated in that sale. And through the public through the public postings of sellers.json and ads.txt files, you're able to check and make sure that those people are meant to be there, or those participants are meant to be there. So it's actually a combat. That's how all of those specs work together. Next slide, please. And so again, just same thing as what Amit went through, is just a few key takeaways. You know, what do you do with this information? As sellers, make sure that you participate with the ads.txt, sellers.json files, keep those up to date, and include known partners. So we've seen, you know, in the news issues where fraud is able to be perpetuated even with ads.txt files in place. And that really comes down to ads.txt file maintenance and hygiene. You should only put people into the file that you have known relationships with. It could be your partner's partner, but you should still be able to validate sort of how that works. Don't just, if someone emails you and says, please put me in your file, you know, you should probably do a few more checks if you're not familiar with who that is. And then as buyers, you can make asks of your technology partners. So of your DSP, you can, it's very common to make sure that you're only buying as.txt verified sellers as a filter within a buying platform. And then you can also start to ask, so some of the sellers.json and supply chain object, I would say are newer than ads.txt and still working through adoption, but it's always good to have conversations with your buying platforms about any type of implementation checks that they have around these standards. And so that could be something like, you know, do you check for completed supply chain objects? Do you do any checks of the sellers.json file against bid requests incoming to sort of verify that they're authenticated sellers? You can ask those things of your buying platforms, and that helps to, again, they're filters, they're options for a campaign, and there are definitely more conservative approaches, and there are less conservative approaches to how you filter against some of these specifications. But it's always helpful to have that conversation with your buying platform partners. And then again, I'll have that last call out for anyone who wants to get involved in the ongoing developments. These types of specifications are continually being reviewed, and certainly as new sort of channels or placements of content pop up, working groups are focused on how to extend support to those, like with CTV. We have a working group that's currently working through what does that AdSet.txt specification look like for CTV environments, to help sort of extend the fraud protection to that environment. Next slide, I think that's it. Yes.
All right, thank you very much. Fantastic stuff, thank you. Let me just take over the slides here. And, it's lovely to have the guys dial in from San Francisco. We're about to have them join some local industry experts on a panel to talk this through a little deeper. But here in Australia, we have a project running between a transparency working group that have recently been getting together. In fact, both Emil and Adele and in the panel are sitting on that with a few others. And we're going to do some education and awareness around these standards and try and bring them to life in a manner that's sort of conducive for everyone, whether we visualize it or even manage it through a video, we'll see. So we'll definitely be working with Jill on that. And thank you, Jill, again. We kept you pretty busy the last few weeks. And it's great to have Amit with us also. And as he mentioned, look out for his blog posts on the Tech Lab website. We do tend to share them, and he's done a couple recently, one on CTV and OTT and the differentiation between them, which we actually incorporated into our CTV handbook, which is just recently released. Thanks so much for your help with that, Amit. And also, you may have seen we pushed out a press release today around a commitment to these standards and a little more education, and Amit has helped us with a tabulation of that we'll hopefully have a time to look at a bit later, and he's also provided us with a quote on the release. So we really appreciate the support. It's a collaborative effort. So if we can have the other panelists join us. That's the wrong slide. Thank you. Bit by bit, we'll. It's quite a big group list. It's a super panel. So start pinging your questions through to the Q&A, and I'll incorporate them into the questions. Worry not. And in fact, I'll start with you, Amit, just because it's lovely to have you on here, and working quite closely with Tech Lab as we do with our councils and IAB Australia. Honestly, the work that you guys put out, I always think it's so impressive, the number of updates you're continuously releasing and supporting. And just how does that work with your working groups? Because we may have a working group here of say 10 to 20. 20 for us is a big group. You have working groups of several hundred I've seen in the States. How does that work as a process?
That's a very interesting question there. The way it really typically works is that we try to break it down into subgroups, right? So yes, there are hundreds of people. I think the programmatic working group has about 400 people, I guess, in total, which is mind blowing. I find that people are really people involve themselves in different levels, right? So we have the people who are the hardcore, write down all the proposals and bring it for discussion. Then we have people who basically provide feedback for those proposals, and then we have people who really are there to provide feedback during the calls and or on our Slack channels. But are really more focused on making sure they're abreast of what's going on and make sure that their plans are in line with what discussions we have going on in the standards. So that's the kind of the breadth of personas, I guess, that we have in the working groups. But probably more important is that we try to break it down into subgroups, which is where a lot of the initial work happens, right? So I have a subgroup right now working on the CTV AdOps.txt effort that Jill mentioned. I have another group which is actually working on a ads.cert replacement, actually, which basically like Jill mentioned, ads.cert has still been on beta has some adoption challenges. So we're trying to figure out what really does make sense. Look at SSAI, look at billing notifications. So yeah. Before I go too far into that tangent, the way we work is really to break it down into subgroups and get work done there before we then move on to the wider groups, and also to reach out to all the local IABs as well and get feedback from each of those groups as well.
Yeah, no, we really appreciate that. And you do sometimes hold sort of virtual live events which act as sort of town halls for the specialists and tech ops or AdOps that want to dive into some of these details a little further. And we're actually looking to incorporate a couple of these later in the year. So I know there's a number of people on this call that love to get into the dirty details of those discussions. So
right.
Yeah, thank you for all the support. And Jill, just flicking over to you on the back of that presentation. Thank you so much. We know that ads.txt has been a real success in terms of adoption, and it's something that we can, different methods of trying to track the levels of adoption and usage. Is that the same that you can do with the platforms in terms of, say, sellers.json at least, and perhaps even the object, or is it more difficult to actually check on and have an idea of the success of adoption? We had to just check in with each of the vendors on a one-by-one basis.
No, it is the same concept in that it's a public file that can be crawled. So you sort of have the same way to check adoption, which has been, I would say, that was released last summer on it.
That sounds about right.
and we've definitely seen an uptick, especially with the major players. So I mean, it is easy to track and likely being added to like any crawlers that already existed for ads.txt to sort of source that information are likely making upgrades to include sellers.json data.
JJ, you're on mute.
So I am. How fantastic. Sorry about that. So one of the sort of, it's not unknown, but it's not so well known here, and I think we want to bring it to life in that piece of education too, is the ads.txt aggregator and how that's utilized and how that can be utilized for different companies. That's something we're probably going to do a bit of work on here also. If we look at it from the buyer's perspective, Emil as a DSP, a major DSP, MediaMath, how aware do you feel that marketers are in terms of these standards and insistent upon their adoption and usage from a buyer's perspective through platforms such as yours?
Yeah, thanks, JJ, and thanks to Jill and Amit for that really great overview. Yeah, from what we're hearing from marketers that we work with is that probably brands themselves don't closely examine the standards themselves that closely. More often it's looking to their agencies or their in-house activation teams to be up to date with those standards and to utilize them when they're released. And I guess rather than brands proactively ensuring that their supply chain is using the most up-to-date standards, we tend to see the interest comes in waves, and those kind of major events that drive awareness and pushes for adoption. So yeah, recently certainly it was the fraud events like Ice Bucket and DrainerBot. We were seeing a lot more inquiries around the standards to prevent against fraud. So some of the ones Jill and Amit mentioned, ad.txt and ads.txt and Jill as Jason, certainly grew in awareness and adoption. Now we're seeing an increasing interest from marketers and agencies around SBO and supply chain transparency. I guess it's really very much brought the supply chain object front of mind. And I guess as we see the industry move more towards transparency, we'd expect marketers to take more care in understanding those IAB Tech Lab standards.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the intent of the release today, for instance, and we've tabulated the requirements for each part of the ecosystem, and it's obviously simplifying it, but just sort of call to action in terms of a commitment of what each type of business needs to do to try and help build awareness and adoption. So, I mean, Malcolm, as a brand here, working for ANZ, thank you. It's good to see you again. In terms of just, you know, Jill was talking about brand suitability and Amit was referencing to the sort of levels of appetite of risk for different companies. How do you as a major bank manage your digital media quality, particularly in turbulent times?
I think, yeah, from a brand safety perspective, it's always been one of those activities that we don't want to get too involved in as marketers, and going across the rest of the industry, or sorry, across the rest of our stakeholders within the bank. I don't want to be trying to explain to people the complexities of the supply chain. I don't want to be explaining to people that, oh, there's a very small risk that we are controlling that our activity may accidentally fund terrorism. That's not a conversation we want to be having on a regular basis. So we do want there to be lots of controls in place that will help us avoid those conversations. Secondly, I think this isn't just a technology solution. So I think there's an assumption that basically, somebody's going to wave a magic wand and produce a piece of technology that will somehow solve all of this. I think we seem to have calmed down at one point. I think there were a lot of people promising that blockchain would come along and just solve all of this and we'd never have to worry again. But I think what we've seen is two things happen. So firstly, there's some people who just want to look respectable. So we've had a couple of instances where we've got slightly dodgy publishers actually taking creative assets and putting them on their website so that they look more respectable. They're not actually ad serving. They're not actually making money out of the system, but they're still causing the same brand damage that would happen if we were accidentally buying. So technology isn't the solution there. Secondly, there's been a lot of awareness increase across the public around the idea, as Joe was saying, of brand suitability. So Breitbart is a fantastic example. I think one day the internet woke up and sleeping giants did a fantastic job of mobilizing people to start getting in touch with brands and say, why are you here? And this is the problem of programmatic, is a lot of, I think personally, I was at the time completely unaware of Breitbart as a site. And just all of a sudden people are saying, why are you on Breitbart? So we had to then have a conversation, okay, well, Breitbart is a site that is pretty right-wing. And actually within the taxonomy at the time, it hadn't been identified as a particularly right-wing site because I think whoever we were using had a very manual process. Somebody had looked at the site and hadn't realized that it had the problems that it had. So overall, I don't feel from a marketing perspective that we want to talk about brand safety. And equally, I feel that we don't have a space. And equally, I feel we don't have a space where we are looking at other brands and saying, hey, those guys are really good at brand safety. We only notice when it's bad.
Yeah, there is that aspect of no news is good news, but at least we have if there are tools for you to be able to retrospectively dig down and pull out the actual domains, and it adds to the tools that you have, it adds to the armory, and that level of awareness is something that we really want to build on.
Yes. And so just to jump back on that, so yeah, there's the brand safety aspect, and then all of this, all of the pieces that we're talking about here, I think add to the financial transparency. And I think the financial transparency is slightly separate from brand safety, but we still need to be in a space where we can talk to people about where our money is going, and have some level of certainty that we know where that money ends up and who is actually getting a bite of the pie.
Yeah, I mean, the commercial arrangements between different entities is one thing. Being able to provide you as a business and with your vendor partners the insights and the commitment to transparency to see what's going where is the key to underpin that. I can see you're locked down there as I'm in Melbourne. So is Emil. So I'm expecting my son to burst in just to keep you all on your toes. But as Jess, I'm going to move to you as a verification vendor, particularly around COVID. We did a bit of work here locally around the impact of some news content sites with just sort of very kind of old school, very blunt usage of keywords and blocking those keywords on certain sites. I mean, do you feel there's an opportunity for brands to be a bit more creative and take advantage of the increased traffic currently and put more of a positive spin on things?
Yeah, there's definitely an opportunity for brands to be a bit more creative in this space. If we go back and think, COVID created a really unprecedented disruption in all our lives, and it was the job of journalists and online news publishers to continue to keep us informed. And I know personally my news consumption increased exponentially during this time as I tried to stay informed with the impact of COVID. But unfortunately, publishers were being punished for their good work, and advertisers were either blocking on the word COVID or COVID-related words, or even blocking the news category completely. So in December last year, for example, there were 0 instances of COVID-related content being blocked, and by April this year, COVID-related words were the top blocked words globally. And this really unnecessarily punished publishers and also advertisers, because they lost out on the reach and scale to reach their ideal audience. But there was no playbook during this time. And so it was just a knee-jerk reaction and a blanket approach to ensure some level of brand safety. And Amit earlier touched on it. There are actually some ways as marketers that we can better approach this situation. So if we are fast forward to today, we're definitely seeing advertisers deploy more creative strategies to reach their audience. In a recent WFA report, it said about 79% of marketers have changed their creative messaging and moved away from commercial to a more social message and mobilizing on empathy. We're also seeing advertisers deploy a cognitive semantic targeting approach, and this really means leveraging contextual targeting. So what this means is that it enables advertisers to target the type of content that they're comfortable appearing adjacent to, rather than just deploying a blanket approach and blocking all coronavirus content or blocking news completely. So this approach is understanding the topics, entities, emotions, and sentiment of the content itself, and it really allows for a more granular targeting strategy. So for example, if an article was published that said how to stay fit during COVID, a blanket approach where you were blocking all COVID related words or all news would mean that that content would be blocked and that publisher would be unnecessarily published. But if a more cognitive semantic approach or contextual targeting approach was deployed, then the advertiser would be able to take advantage of the audience and appear adjacent to that positive content. It's really important though that the brand then takes a step back to understand its values and the values of their audience so that they can correctly create the type of contextual targeting that suits their brand and target towards the right topics, entities, emotions, and sentiment for their brand and away from those that don't suit their brand values.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's absolutely true. And unprecedented is that's the point, that there isn't a playbook. I remember many years ago running a trafficking team during 9/11, and it went with an element of us trying to control it. And in the end, it was just a blanket pull. That was quite a day.
Yeah. I mean, and JJ, this is something we can really take on board for the future as well. Now that we know how to approach situations like this, should another similar situation happen, then, as marketers, we know how to approach it and not punish the people that are keeping us informed as a society.
Yeah, that's a great point. Doing a retrospective piece of work, perhaps a standard and guidelines. We've got a workflow project we're going to work on. We could incorporate some of those recommendations that all the AdOps teams might have seen across the country at that time. That's a great idea. Make a note of that. Adele, actually, to build upon that, thank you, Jess. To build.
You muted, JJ.
What an amateur! I do these every week. For goodness' sake, is there an opportunity, do you feel, for technology to add a little more value in terms of personalization and to layer on top of that creative point there that Jess has made?
Absolutely. I think, and Amit covered it, and Jess actually referenced it as well. Like, there is a very large piece of analysis that can support the strategies on both the publisher and the buy side around, the intelligent context and sentiment analysis that Amit mentioned. And the key thing here is around the relevancy. So personalization, bringing it back to the user. Where we saw, as Jess mentioned, the increase in COVID-related blocked terms and keywords, that is one part of the user's story. So when you take a step back and look at, the broader user experience online, our interest in news at this point in time is peaked, obviously, because we want to understand how that impacts our lives and ourselves. But I'm also highly interested in purchasing shoes. So, there is an opportunity to take that. And we, similar to what Jess mentioned, we did see in the very early stages, there was kind of advertisers taking different strategies. The retooling approach was the most interesting one, where they took the sentiment, they took the current market conditions, and actually, blended that into their messaging to make it more relevant for the user's experience right now. The one thing to sort of stress in this time is there is obviously a lot of analysis around keywords and the ability to leverage that for brand safety and that risk avoidance that was mentioned as well. But the publishers do actually sit on a very large and extensive data set and a solid understanding of their users' experience within their environment. The ability for brands to work very closely with publishers, these news content portals to really understand, COVID is one part of this user's experience within their environment. What more do we know about them? Then when you layer on top that personalization of advertising and the messaging, and we will start to actually see that come to fruition more and more as we delve into the world of, people-based marketing. So leveraging a lot more of the advertiser data sets and amalgamating that with the publisher's data to find, the ultimate, right time, right message, and right level of engagement. And that's where we'll start to see, I think, a lot of the issues of the past, the ability to just, avoid risk by blocking simple keywords. We'll see those as more opportunities in the future.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And actually to focus on the fraudulent aspect a little bit more, because there's probably nothing as unsafe for a brand than funding crime ultimately. The bit that slightly worries me more is where fraudulent inventory is being unknowingly bought. There's an aspect where you can protect yourself, but how can we be certain, Jill, from a Tech Lab perspective, that we're giving buyers and the industry the right tools to ensure that's not happening? People aren't unknowingly buying fraudulent inventory.
That's where we focus on transparency. Again, I won't say that it solves for everything. There are certainly a handful of strategies to use, and some of your technology partners can help in more pattern analysis, looking for potential fraud that way. But what we focus on from a standards perspective is trying to be transparent throughout that supply chain, so that even if as a marketer, you don't necessarily want to know exactly all of the details of what makes up the supply chain, your technology partners should. And they should be able to trace a piece of inventory, like a DSP should be able to see the hops that were made in a given transaction before they ultimately purchased from a publisher, and be able to help give that assurance to their agency partners or direct brand partners. So that's really where I'd say we focus when it comes to trying to solve with standards.
Thank you. And Jess, as one of those technology vendors, with the real focus and excitement around the opportunities that are coming through CTV and OTT these days, and the increased supply there, particularly these unusual times, what do we need to be mindful of when seeking to minimize any levels of ad fraud within these newer environments and newer devices?
Yeah, so specifically for CTV, I guess we can bucket it into what publishers need to be mindful of and what buyers need to be mindful of. So if we look at publishers first, I guess the three things that publishers will need to be mindful of is firstly to move towards supply side standardization. So this means getting publishers to support CTV specific standardized data points, and that will help separate fraud from false positives that can be created by lack of data. The second is to ensure that device or hastening device registration. So CTV device makers should really be prioritizing reporting their user agent string to the IAB. And then finally is for publishers to standardize their identification practices by working with the IAB on standardized app IDs in CTV when they become available. In the meantime, publishers should be consistent and descriptive in how they name their properties. From a buy side, it's important to work with a third-party vendor that can correctly identify fraud signals on CTV. So due to the unstandardized nature of CTV, incorrectly identifying signals can lead to false positives. And secondly, it's important to leverage industry standards like, ads.txt for CTV, which was mentioned earlier. And this ensures that we're buying from a verified seller.
Yep, thank you. That's fantastic. And Emil, I know you wanted to come in on this topic also.
Yeah, just echoing some of those thoughts that Jess mentioned there, and particularly from the buy side. MediaMath was pretty active with our partners in putting out some key recommendations for what the buy side should be looking to do, and certainly encouraging CTV supply partners to act on those standards as well. I guess as we've seen the programmatic industry grow, the kind of bad news is that whenever there's been a growing emerging channel, that has been an opportunity for advertisers and people within the industry, it's also been an opportunity for the bad actors and the fraudsters as well. So certainly with CTV, as we've been all stuck at home and there's been huge increases in people viewing it, at the same time that has unfortunately represented an opportunity for fraudsters. So it's become a bit of a prize for those for that crime to take advantage of. So yeah, those recommendations that we put out were certainly to make sure that people using the MediaMath platform were as protected as they could be from that heightened risk.
And Amit, as Senior Product Director at Tech Lab, and this is a real area that I know you love dearly. Are there any updates that you have from your perspective?
Yeah, I definitely do love it, and I also agree with what Emil just said about this being a very, very major area of focus right now, and that's why all there's so much attention and so much interest really by the fraudsters as well to perpetuate fraud in this area, right? And actually, I think Jess has actually covered a lot of what I was thinking that I want to cover, things like the user agents, the application IDs. The two things that I'll add on to that is we like I mentioned earlier, we do have a initiative going on right now, a subgroup, if you will, focusing on CTV ads.txt, and the other part is again the one thing which is important to remember is that SSAI, server-side ad insertion, is a big part of CTV delivery, right? So basically, because of the breadth of devices, because of the the bandwidth issues and so on, SSAI has definitely become a primary focus. I read somewhere about 80 to 90%, though that might vary depending on who you're working with, is delivered using SSAI. And that, I think, has its own set of challenges about, okay, how do you differentiate between a signal coming from a SSAI system versus a server farm that's trying to fraudulently fire signals, right? So there are some additional complications that brings in, and those are the kind of things that we are currently working on.
Great. We're just going to have a couple more questions. We're going to run over time, but participants are staying strong, so that's good. So I think we should continue. I mean, Adele, in terms of transparency, it's been a topic for a while, and I think there are two aspects to it: the sort of technical allowance of transparency in terms of what's happening between the various hops, as Tech Lab like to call it, but also the commercial side, which the two are interlinked, but still feel they're slightly distinct. And what sort of conversations are you seeing around the industry currently on this topic? What do you feel the current status is?
I think we've definitely come a long way, even in the last sort of 3 years, in regards to adoption of standardized practices, ads.txt, supply chain object. All of the large players, as Jill mentioned, are adopting these processes to give transparency to the industry. But transparency is only part of the equation. The second step is obviously accountability. I can go out and say that I'm transparent, but unless I am completely accountable for my actions and my promises to my clients and my partners, that transparency may not hold up, when we're being assessed. So there is those two layers, and then from that there is kind of a lot more education, and I think everyone needs to do a general like upskilling in terms of their understanding of the players, how they're contributing to that transparency in the industry, and then feeling that they have that level of accountability and they can hold their partners accountable. With those two, we'll continue to see the industry evolve, and I definitely think it's come a long way in the 8 or so years that I've been working amongst it. But this is part, like we're still on the journey. There's still a way to go, but through the ability to have those very honest and frank conversations with all of your partners and understand the true lay of the land, you'll have that ability to be both transparent and accountable.
Yeah, thank you. And look, Malcolm, it's you as the brand, the marketer here in the room, as it were. We're always talking about you and your needs and wants and how your money's being spent. How do you feel the industry could be made more accountable in generally?
I think my theme with accountability is consequences, which I feel at the moment, brand safety violations, we tend to basically say, if somebody violates our brand safety, then we'll just never work with them again. And I think we need to have some kind of standardized consequences for brand safety that sit within our contracts, so that if we're having relatively mild infractions happening on a regular basis, how do we actually tie some kind of financial penalty that goes through the supply sides, and especially with the supply chain objects? How do we start having consequences that flow through the marketplace? Because right now, if I have an issue, I can get angry and I can shout at people, which is great. And maybe I might, stop working with a particular partner or another particular partner, but eventually I'll just run out of partners. So I do want there to be something that says, for each impression, or for each ad buy that happens, I'll charge a publisher and it'll flow through the supply chain $10. Those add up very quickly, so that can be a significant cost if there are a decent number of impressions going through, but it gives me some way to go back to my stakeholders and say, I've done something. We appeared in a bad place and we were able to do something, and we can now close the matter. Each time at the moment, it feels like we scramble.
Yeah, fair enough. Consequences. I mean, I like that. It has to be right. I mean, ultimately. And part of that is some of the commitments and awareness that we wanted to push out with the press release, and we'll take a look at those, the table in a moment. But just as one of the final points, I thought, and we have a couple of questions coming through, which will require some quite long responses. I'm certainly happy to respond to them in writing, or perhaps in some of the forthcoming education. I mean, there's one in terms of in relation to censorship. And the best practices that will funnel down here, and that will come into play, I think, particularly with the ACCC review and how we input into that as a best practice and recommendation. So that's a bit of a moving feast at the moment. But one project that's a collaborative global sort of movement, as it were, and I know a couple of the companies on this webinar are involved, is Source. So I thought, I know MediaMath, a very big champion of Source. So I thought, Emil, if you give us just a quick elevator pitch on what Source is. It might be interesting for the attendees to hear.
Yeah, I don't really want it to be a pitch, but it's getting traction. And it is very much, for those who don't know, a collective initiative aimed at fairly lofty goals to radically update the programmatic media supply chain. So it's really addressing a lot of the forward brand safety and transparency challenges that we've discussed today head on. The driving belief is that it should be there to drive more trust in programmatic, and to benefit both the buy and the sell side. So we're working with close to 15 best-in-breed partners who, along with MediaMath, are really collaborating to build what we want to be a 100% accountable, addressable, and aligned ecosystem. So very removed from what some of the bad stories around programmatic gets in the press, into a way that it can be far better in the future. So from an SSB perspective, we launched with Rubicon first, Pubmatic have recently followed, and then the Talaria side of what is now Magnite will be the next cab off the rank. And right now we're seeing locally around 26 billion ad impressions a month available through these new transparent pipes. So this includes inventory across publishers like REA, Nine, News Corp, Daily Mail, and ESPN. So yeah, certainly building a foundation for something to be far different to what the programmatic supply chain of old was. We're seeing Index Exchange likely coming on board next, and then BidSwitch to be integrated by the end of the year. Other partners include AdOps, Moat, and LiveRamp. So they're key partners where we're looking to address fraud, obviously with Moat, and a guaranteed viewable market with Moat, and increasing that end-to-end audience match rate across the media supply chain with LiveRamp. So we really have a pretty exciting roadmap that we're working on together. I guess the best measure of the traction that we're having is some of the results that we've seen that address those areas of concern in building greater transparency for advertisers as to how their marketing dollars are being spent. And they're also seeing, improved CPMs and improved metrics like viewability. And then on the other side, publishers are being rewarded with greater shares of media budgets. So yeah, we're early days and a really exciting roadmap, and working with a lot of partners across the globe to bring something very interesting that drives greater value to life.